who, what, why, how, where. You know, asking those 5 very basic, fundamental questions often proves to be an effective, efficient, and thorough means of maybe researching some subject. Or maybe you are attempting to analyze some set of circumstances. You know, the process would go something like this. Well, who was involved? And what happened? Why did it happen? How did it affect those that were involved? And where did it ultimately lead to? Now, friends, it does not always have to be a formal process or necessarily an official investigation. I'm sure some of those very questions are going to be asked with regards to the fire that took place this morning in downtown Williamston. You know, who, what, why, how, where? But friends, even in our everyday speech, I believe probably, maybe sometimes unconsciously, we go through that set of questions in an attempt to better understand something or better analyze, again, a set of circumstances. Well, it is for that reason that, at least in my humble opinion, that approach is a very prudent one for our thoughtful contemplation of the subject of our current series of sermons, a changed life. A changed life. And so that being our approach, well, Ricky, I know I have to say eventually our 4 points, 4 major points, Lord willing, eventually those 4 points are basically going to be posing those rudimentary questions. Who, what, why, how, and where. Now, the first question, who, well, is actually answered in the subtitle of our subject here, Paul. Paul, that's the who. And as seasoned Bible students, we are all very well acquainted with this primary figure of the New Testament, this principal personality that we encounter in reading the New Testament. He's introduced to us, actually in Acts chapter 7, by the name of Saul, which would have been his Hebrew name. Sometimes he is designated as Saul of Tarsus, no doubt to designate him and distinguish him from other Sauls. But we better know him as the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul. I believe it could be accurately stated that except for Jesus Christ himself, this man, Paul, he did more for the promotion and spread of New Testament Christianity in its formative years than anyone else. Now, please understand, that's not to diminish the labors of others. That is not to dismiss what they did, because it certainly was on grand scale as well, as we think of the apostles and others who were very instrumental in the spread and promotion of New Testament Christianity in its formative years. But at least from what is documented for us in our New Testament scriptures, I believe we could say Paul probably did more to that end. Now, obviously, this fundamental and very instrumental role, this critical role in the spread of New Testament Christianity, is owing to, in part, his evangelistic labors that are recounted for us in the book of Acts. Friends, the Apostle Paul took the gospel of Jesus Christ not only to various regions, but to continents, multiple continents. We find him in the regions of Judea, Samaria, Syria. He's going to go to Asia and Asia Minor. He's going to be going over into the regions of Europe, present-day Europe, and even over to Italy, into Rome. And so he took the gospel through these evangelistic efforts to a number of continents. And so certainly in that respect, he was very instrumental in the promotion and spread of New Testament Christianity. But not only that, please understand, he also was a very major contributor in providing for us our New Testaments today. You probably are well aware that the Holy Spirit employed the inspired pen of Paul, this man that we're talking about, to write 13, Angie, maybe 14, depending on whether or not you ascribe Hebrews to Paul. Here's what we do know. The human penman is not identified for us in the pages of the book of Hebrews. And so there are various opinions about that. But either way, 13 or 14 of the 27 books that today comprise our New Testaments, friend, they were written by the hand of this man, the Apostle Paul. And as you well know, all of those have been preserved for us, all future generations. To what end? So that we could learn more, that we could be instructed in the truths pertaining to Jesus and New Testament Christianity. Friends, apart from this book, its message, Christianity would not go forth. And so, inasmuch as Paul, in his own day, those who were contemporary with him benefited from his preaching it, but then, inasmuch as he wrote nearly half of the New Testament, and that is preserved for the promotion of New Testament Christianity today, I think we would all agree he played a very major role in the promotion and spread of New Testament Christianity, and continues to today. Because in addition to those things which contributed to the promotion of New Testament Christianity, we also have to add this one: his exemplary influence. Friends, the Apostle Paul has provided countless Christians through the ages. I'm sure we would include ourselves among that number, with inspiration and encouragement and challenging by our reading of his life and our studying of those inspired messages that he sent to individuals and congregations of God's people. In fact, Paul himself on several occasions would urge others to follow him as an example. But please note, always with this qualifier. 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 1, be ye followers of me, even as I also am of Christ. But it is that aspect of the answer to the who question. The Apostle Paul, that's who this study is about, if you will. But particularly as we think about who we are studying about, I want us to keep in mind that particular aspect of his contribution, and that is his being an exemplary influence, his being an encouragement for others. Why? Because that is especially pertinent as we go forward in this series of studies. Because you see, our study, it does center upon the great Apostle Paul and the changed life that we witness in him. And yes, we are going to be answering the questions of what, why, how, where, as it pertains to that change that was so evident in the life of the Apostle Paul. But ultimately, the answer to the who question in this series is me and you. As it relates to those other questions, those again need to be answered as it relates to me and to you. We are carefully analyzing the changed life of this man of the past, observed in Paul, the great Apostle Paul. But we do that because it serves as an example. It serves as a model. It serves as an exemplary illustration that can and should be used by each of us as we then reflect upon our own life as a Christian and the change that our lives should evidence. Because friends, please hear me. that change, for me, for you, that change should closely resemble the change that we see in the Apostle Paul. And so again, I reiterate, Ricky, I did it in the first lesson, and I'll continue to do it throughout this series. As we give careful consideration to the changed life of Paul, let us never lose sight that the practical benefit of this study will be derived only by answering this question. How? See, that's one of those fundamental questions. How does all this apply to me? How does it apply to you? So, with those thoughts in mind, a quick review. And I handed out number 1 outline, and that addressed the what. Again, the who is the Apostle Paul, but the what? The change. What was that change? And we have it defined up here in these 2 words, defiant to devoted. And so we initially talked about what those words mean by way of definition, and especially to see the change, the dramatic change that they demonstrate when a person goes from being defiant to a cause to then being devoted to the same cause. And that's the change we saw in the Apostle Paul. He went from being defiant, openly, boldly resisting Jesus, New Testament Christianity, and the Lord's church, and he went from that to being changed to being devoted to that cause, to Jesus, to New Testament Christianity, to the Lord's church. And then we talked about how that manifested his defiance and his devotion, how they manifested themselves, at least in a general way, in the life that we see at these, at 2 different junctures of this man's life, the Apostle Paul. So that's the what. But then, last week we, for all intent and purposes, was asking the question of why. Because giving notice to the change, we want to look at what was the cause for that change. Why did Paul change? Because, friends, some people are resistant to change, especially dramatic changes, traumatic changes, changes that are going to impact a person's life in a profound way. And that's the change we're talking about. So why? Why would Paul choose to make this change, to embrace this dramatic change? Now, last week in introducing this point, we offered an observation that in trying to explain the cause for Paul's embracing this change, ascertaining the why would have he done that, it shows that his profound change proves to be a very compelling testimony to the truthfulness of Christianity. Because we have to ask the question, why else? Why else? What other explanation? What other answer to the question of why would Paul have embraced this dramatic change? Because if it was not because of the truthfulness of what he embraced in that change, how else do you explain that this man, Saul of Tarsus, enjoying the advantages of his privileged status among the Jews, he would surrender all that. He would give it all up. For what? For then inviting fierce, constant, persistent persecution into his life. From that moment forward, he is going to now be receiving the stripes. He is now going to be the one in prison. He now is going to be exposed constantly to death. Why would somebody make that change if it were not for the truthfulness that change entailed? Now, to give some support to that, we mentioned a man that lived back in the 1700s, a man by the name last week of Lord George Lyttelton. Again, he was an Oxford scholar. He was part of the British Parliament. He was a very well-known man back then, and he was a skeptic. He was not a believer in New Testament Christianity. And so he set out, if you will, to disparage the truthfulness of New Testament Christianity by examining the change of this man, Paul. He was confident that in his research, he could discredit Christianity by demonstrating that Paul's conversion could be attributed to some other reason than how it is explained in the Scriptures. But as we noted last week, friends, Littleton's careful and thorough research brought him just to the opposite conclusion. His investigation yielded a paper in which he defended the truthfulness of New Testament Christianity. Friends, the change of this man, Saul of Tarsus, to the Apostle Paul, that change brought about this change in Mr. Littleton. He went from being a skeptic to New Testament Christianity to a believer in it. Again, his paper to this day is still a very powerful defense and great treatise for Christianity, and he based it solely on the change of the Apostle Paul. Let me read again a quote that came from or is found in that paper by Mr. Littleton. Listen to it, quote, "The conversion and apostleship of St. Paul alone, duly considered, was of itself a demonstration sufficient to prove Christianity to be a divine revelation." End of quote. Mr. Littleton asked the question, why do you think this man changed? And his conclusion was, it couldn't have been anything other than how it is explained by Paul himself. Now, friends, that's Mr. Littleton's assessment. But think about how the Apostle Paul himself, several times on trial for his life, he would use his changed life as his defense, trying to convince those groups, those audiences that he was addressing, as to its truthfulness and why they should embrace it. Friends, instead of pleading for his innocence, instead of trying to show his innocence, no. In Acts 22, when he stood before that murderous mob there in Jerusalem, and then in Acts chapter 26, as he was before the King Agrippa, on both occasions, he wasn't seeking his innocence, he was trying to convince them of the truthfulness of the New Testament Christianity that he was now preaching. And what did he base it on? His change. His changed life. And that's why in those two places in the New Testament, we have Paul rehearsing his change, because he knew that was sufficient testimony to prove the truthfulness of what he has embraced. All right, but now let's get to the cause itself. Let's turn our attention. Let's pose the question, why would Paul embrace the dramatic change? What would it take, if you will, to affect this dramatic change in the life of this man, Saul of Tarsus? And as I suggested last week, it has to be the word evidence. Evidence. Evidence speaks to a ground for believing something. It is something that furnishes proof, establishing a thing to be true. And friends, that alone, I would submit, is adequate to explain the change that we observe in this man, Saul of Tarsus. Saul was presented evidence so compelling, so persuasive, that it was the solid ground for a new belief. He was presented evidence so compelling, so persuasive, that it was undeniable to him. And it convinced Saul that something was absolutely true, despite what he had thought previously. And so what was that evidence? What was that evidence? What form did it take? And the answer, friends, is found in reading the account of Saul's conversion. Now, again, he's going to rehearse it in chapters 22 and 26, and they certainly come into play in our answering of the question, what was the cause for the change? But I want us to look at the inspired historical narrative of it that is given to us in Acts chapter 9. Acts chapter 9, if you'll turn there quickly. Here we are going to find the answer to the question, what evidence was presented to Paul that was so compelling, so persuasive, that he knew it had to be true, and so he embraced it and brought on this change. And friends, the first thing is a person. A person. You see, Saul of Tarsus is going to encounter a person that is going to forever change his life. Now, I think we already know who that is. But just to kind of bring us to that point, let's quickly go to Acts chapter 9. The last time we heard about Paul is back in chapter 8, following the death of Stephen. And remember, Saul played a role in that. In fact, Acts chapter 8 and verse 1 says, and Saul was consenting unto his, Stephen's, death. And notice, and at that time there was a great persecution against the church, which was at Jerusalem. That persecution, in large part, led by this very man, Saul of Tarsus, resulted in those thousands of Christians who had now become part of the congregation there in Jerusalem being scattered. It reports that at the end of verse 1 there of chapter 8, and they were all scattered abroad throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except for the apostles. When you go over to Acts chapter 11 and verse 19, we learn that these Christians did not only, in light of this persecution, go just in Judea and Samaria. We find them over in Phoenicia. We find them in the island of Cyprus. We find them in Antioch of Syria. And so the church was scattered out of Jerusalem because of this persecution. But to the credit of our forefathers, look at verse 4. Therefore they that were scattered abroad went everywhere preaching the word. So wherever they went, they continued to preach the message. Notwithstanding the fact that maybe, knowing that our lives were being threatened, as was Stephen's, and imprisonment was now being done by Saul of Tarsus. In fact, look at verse 3, back in chapter 8. As for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering into every house, hailing men and women, committed them to prison. Friends, if you knew that being a Christian meant possible imprisonment, possible beatings, possible death, in your fleeing, would you be prone to tell others about it? Let others know you were a Christian? I'm not sure we would. But again, how we need to embrace this evangelistic spirit of the first century Christians. Because knowing of that persecution, that being the cause of their leaving their homes, think about that. They're leaving their homes, they're leaving their livelihoods, maybe leaving their families behind, and they are going to other places, but instead of that persecution silencing them, they're proclaiming it. So that's the last we heard of Saul of Tarsus until we come to chapter 9. Chapter 9, and Saul, verse 1, yet breathing out threatenings and slaughter. I think Angie said she had an ESV. I believe they have murder. Threatenings and murder. That's the word. Against the disciples of the Lord. Paul continued his persecution. It may have been that when he saw the church scattered out of Jerusalem, and that's where it, for all intent and purposes, had been confined to. When he saw that happen, you know what he might have thought? He had been successful. He had dispersed the church. It was no longer something to be that was going to threaten other Jews. He might have thought they were successful in, as he said, trying to destroy the church. He might have thought he was successful in it. But then with time, words started coming back. Words from Judea, Samaria, even foreign cities, that Christians fled and were continuing to preach this message about Jesus. They were continuing to assemble. They were continuing to establish congregations. And for that reason, Saul of Tarsus would not cease his persecution. In fact, notice he's going to expand it. Again, chapter 9, verse 1, Saul yet breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord, he went unto the high priest, and he desired of him letters to Damascus. Please understand, Damascus is not in the region of Judea. This is outside the region of where the Jews lived. This is now in Syria. But Saul was willing to leave his homeland, travel to this foreign city. For what purpose? Letters to Damascus, to the synagogues, that if he found any of this way, whether they were men or women, he might bring them bound unto Jerusalem. Friends, that was no small effort. This was about 140 miles removed from Jerusalem. Brother McGarvey in his commentary said by foot that would have taken about 4 to 5 days, maybe even 6. Saul was willing to travel that distance because he had heard that in the city of Damascus, even though it was a foreign city, it had a large population of Jews, and there were those in that Jewish population who had yielded to this heresy about Jesus, and they had been converted, and now there were Christians there in Damascus, and he had learned about that, and he sought authoritative letters that would give him permission to go to Damascus and there bring them back under arrest and have them stand trial as heretics, guilty of blasphemy because of their allegiance to Jesus of Nazareth. So that's where we pick it up. Let's read through this and let's just make a few observations. Verse 3, and as he journeyed, he came near to Damascus, and suddenly there shined round about him a light from heaven. And he fell to the earth, and he heard a voice saying unto him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And he said, Who art thou, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. And he, Saul, trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what would thou have me to do? And the Lord said unto him, Arise and go into the city, and it shall be told thee what thou must do. And the men which journeyed with me stood speechless, hearing a voice, but seeing no man. And Saul rose from the earth, and when his eyes were open, he saw no man. But they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. Friends, these astonishing events occurring here on the road to Damascus brought Saul of Tarsus into an encounter with a person that forever changed this man's life, Jesus Christ. Luke does not report it here, but Paul tells us this was around noonday. And so we're at lunchtime. We're at 12 noon, when the sun is the highest in the sky, the brightest. And yet, this light that shone from heaven, Paul will say later, outshone the brilliance of the sun. And please understand, he was not the only one who saw it. All those who were with him saw it. In fact, its effect on all of them, including Saul, was the same. It caused them to fall prostrate to the ground. A miraculous light. But then attending that was a voice that issued from heaven. And that voice personally addressed Saul. He's the only one being addressed. And so here Luke would report that the men, verse 7, they stood speechless. They heard a voice, but they couldn't understand it. They saw the light. The light had the effect of causing them to fall to the ground, but then they stood, and when they stood speechless because they knew something was being said, but they could not understand it. They could not see the individual, and they could not understand what he was saying to Saul. But please understand, friends, they had witnessed enough to know that this was a supernatural, a miraculous event. And that was not lost on Saul. And when he heard his name from that voice issuing out of heaven, addressing him in the Hebrew language. He's going to explain to King Agrippa over in Acts chapter 26, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? Friends, please understand, he full well knew this vision was from heaven. He couldn't dispute that. He couldn't dispute that this voice was addressing him. But what he didn't understand, who is it that's accusing me of persecuting them? I'm sure when he heard that claim, you persecute me, his mind was no doubt reflecting back on what he had done maybe to Stephen and to others in the city of Jerusalem and other places. Maybe his mind was thinking about in Damascus and why he was going there to persecute saints there. But here is somebody saying, why do you persecute me? Saul's question, who are you? Who are you? Ricky, I'm just curious, what was Saul thinking the answer might have been? What do you think he was thinking? Whatever he was thinking, I doubt seriously it was the answer he received. Because that voice said, I am Jesus. In the other accounts where Paul is rehearsing it, it's more direct. I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you persecute. I doubt if that's what Saul expected. Because you know what Saul thought about Jesus at this point? He was an imposter. He was a fraud. He was a false prophet. He thought this man was cursed of God. But more than that, he had heard that he had been crucified and put in a tomb. Even though he had heard others like Stephen pronounce that the tomb is empty. He heard others claim that there were eyewitnesses to the risen Christ. That's not what Saul believed about this man. He thought he was a heretic and was dead. And for him to hear Jesus say, it is I that you persecute. You know what else that no doubt convinced Saul of? That when he was guilty of persecuting, imprisoning, beating, putting to death Christians, disciples of Jesus, he was in that act persecuting Jesus himself. I believe he came to understand in that answer that he received on the road to Damascus. Who is it that is claiming I've persecuted you? When he says Jesus, inasmuch as Saul knew that he had never personally met Jesus, certainly had not been involved in his persecution or death, he understood that he and his disciples are of such close and intimate relationship that when he was doing that to Christians, he in fact was doing that to Jesus himself. Friends, can you imagine Saul's state of mind when he heard that answer? When he now was convinced that this man that he thought was dead, this man that he thought was an imposter, a fraud, a false teacher, this man whose disciples that he had put to death as blasphemers, that he is the Christ, the risen Messiah, the one that he had been looking for. Can you imagine his state of mind? I think we get a glimpse of it by what next issues from his mouth. Lord, what would you have me to do? Friends, this proud spirit that was going fearlessly to Damascus to persecute other Christians, believing Jesus to be a false teacher, is now trembling at the feet of that very man and cries out What would you have me to do? Being introduced to the person of Jesus of Nazareth as the risen Christ, the Son of God, the sole Savior. Friends, that was the first piece of compelling evidence that started this change in the person of Saul of Tarsus. You remember what I said evidence is? It's the ground for belief, a new belief. And this is the ground for a new belief, a new conviction on the part of Saul of Tarsus. Now he thinks differently about this Jesus. He is of the conviction now that this Jesus is the Christ. He is the Son of God. He is who Stephen pronounced him to be. And friends, that is going to forevermore shape the remainder of Paul's life. Evidence bringing about faith. You remember what Paul would later say is the grounds for faith? Remember Romans 10:17, a familiar verse, right? Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. Think about it, friends. Paul's faith came by hearing audibly, personally, the very voice of God. He heard Jesus speak in a glorified form to him personally. That was the basis for his faith. That was the basis for now a new conviction. Evidence that something is true, even though he thought very differently a moment before. Now this is the truth. And friends, that evidence, this person that he has encountered, Jesus himself, is going to forevermore change this man's life. Brother McGarvey said, quote, the evidence of his eyes and his ears. He saw the light. He saw some form. Because remember, he is going to say that he saw Jesus Christ. So he saw him for some moments before his eyes, because of the glory, were caused to go shut. But he saw him. And then his ears, he heard him. Friends, the evidence of his eyes and his ears, Brother McGarvey says, cannot be doubted. There he stands with the light of heaven and the glory of God around him. And he says, I am Jesus. End of quote. That's the beginning. But oh, how this one piece of evidence forever changed the life of this man. In fact, listen again to this quote. He says, he is convinced that the vision is divine, and this prepared him to believe what he may further hear, and that's why he asked, what would you have me to do? When that heavenly being, whose word he cannot doubt, says, I am Jesus, listen to what Brother McGarvey says, one new conviction that must, from its very nature, reverse all the purposes of his life, takes possession of his soul. Friends, it's going to take possession of this man and totally reverse everything about this man. As we noted in another previous lesson, it is literally going to turn his world upside down. It is going to change his life in the direction of 180 degrees, but with great force, great torrent. But this was the first piece of evidence. Now, please understand, friends, there has to be more evidence. Because he asked, what must I do? A couple things that are noteworthy here. Did you notice Jesus didn't say do nothing? If there was ever an opportunity for Jesus to say there was nothing more for you to do, you believe now? Saul, you believe that I am Jesus, the risen Christ? That's all. Because, friends, that's a lot of what people hear today. That's all you got to do. And if you have believed that Jesus is the Son of God, you put your trust in Him, there is nothing more for you to do. Friends, if there was ever a time for a man to be told there was nothing to do, here it was. But that isn't the answer Jesus gave to him. Jesus says, there's more for you to do, Saul. There's more for you to do. But I think it's interesting that Jesus didn't answer, sadly, as many people here today. There's nothing else to do. Friends, this is where the change begins for anyone. You have to encounter Jesus Christ. That's where it begins. No, we're not going to have some miraculous, supernatural, miraculous event occur wherein we're going to see Jesus Christ personally. That's not the way it works anymore. In fact, the Bible tells us to the contrary, that Jesus is in heaven. And now we must believe on the evidence that is presented by the testimony given by those who did see Him. But let me ask you, does that mean that we are at a disadvantage? Are we somehow deprived of some blessing because we have less compelling evidence than did Saul of Tarsus? I think we have to say no. And here's why. You remember what Jesus told Thomas, who sought visible evidence over reliable testimony with regards to the fact that He was raised from the dead? You remember what He told him? He said, Thomas, because you have seen me, you believe. But blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. You turn over to 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 8, and there you find those who, like ourselves, whom having never seen, we love Christ, in whom, though now you see Him not, yet you believe in Him, you rejoice with joy unspeakable and full of glory. Friends, the evidence that we have that Jesus is the risen Christ, the Lord of glory, the only one who can deliver us from our sins, and the risen Savior, friends, the evidence that we can have of that is as certain and compelling as was the evidence given to Saul of Tarsus. Ours just comes by inspired testimony. Saul's came by verbal acknowledgement by Jesus Himself. But it's no less reliable. And again, that's where it must begin. You remember Jesus' invitation, come, all ye that are laden and heavy burden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me. Friends, that's where it starts. Here's where we find the first piece of evidence. If we're going to bring about this change, like we see in the Apostle Paul, we're going to have an encounter with Jesus Christ. As we conclude, let me just share this with you. I may have told you this before, but I heard Brother Melvin Otey one time relate the occasion where he was first introduced to his eventual wife. At the time, they were not married. But she invited Melvin, while they were in college together, she invited him to come to services with her, the services at the Church of Christ. And he refused. He said, no, I can't do that. Because he said, I'm not going to play religion, and I know that's not where my heart would be. I wanted to be, watching football or something else, so I'm not going to be able to go with you. And she asked him repeatedly, and he continued to respond by saying, no, I'm sorry, I can't go because I know, it wouldn't be real. It wouldn't be genuine. But then Brother Otey related that he started reading the book of Matthew on his own. And he said when he completed reading that book, he had been told about Jesus before. But he said, I never met Him personally until I read about Him myself. After that evidence, after being introduced to Jesus the Christ through the inspired testimony of the book of Matthew, you know what Brother Otey said he did? He didn't wait. He didn't wait for Janiah to come and invite him to services. He went to her and said, I need to go to services with you because there's something I need to do. Again, what was the first bit of evidence that started that change in motion? It was the same as we see in the person of Saul of Tarsus. It has to begin here, being introduced to Jesus of Nazareth. And so as a song of invitation this morning, we're going to read What will you do with Jesus? See, all of us have to answer that question. Saul of Tarsus had to answer that question. Each of us in encountering Jesus has to answer the question, what will you do with him? Will you, like Saul, be convinced, knowing the evidence is compelling and persuasive and undeniable, and accept him to be who he claims to be, the Son of God, the Savior, the risen Christ? Will you believe that? And then act on that by, like Saul, humbly bowing and saying, Lord, what would you have me to do? Because he'll tell you what to do. And we can help you in that. But even for Christians, friends, we need to be daily challenged by the thought, what am I going to do with Jesus today? What role is he going to play in my life today? Am I going to fall at his feet when I arise this morning and say, Lord, what would you have me to do? What is your will? And then seek to do that.